Hey there, this is Jexy with the Systems Alliance, and in this video we're going to go over this weekend's box office. So coming in at number one this weekend, to no one's surprise, is Ant-Man and the Wasp from Marvel and Disney. What is a little bit of surprise is what it came in at, which is $76 million. So still a good build over the first Ant-Man movie that came out, and coming off of Infinity War, you would expect something pretty large, just how Iron Man 3 built off of the original Avengers to have a really big opening. And it looked like it was going to have a pretty solid opening, possibly even approaching 90 million or somewhere in that 85 million range, considering it opened just under 34 million for Friday alone. However, despite the 34 million on Friday, it only ended up finishing at 76 million for the entire weekend. And this actually makes Ant-Man and the Wasp the number one movie for Marvel, a distinction they maybe didn't want to have, but doesn't really matter. The number one movie in the MCU as far as percentage of the opening being brought in on that first Friday. So when you take a look at it, just under 45% of the total weekend gross came in on Friday. So it'll be interesting to see where this movie ends up, as front-loaded movies such as this one, where they get 45% of their gross on that first weekend day, tend to not hold very well. They tend to have low multipliers, and they also tend to drop pretty fast. Then again, this is a well-rated Marvel movie in the MCU, so it's kind of hard to imagine that happening. So this one will be an interesting one to watch as the weeks go on. Internationally, Ant-Man and the Wasp brought in $85 million and had a very strong debut in South Korea with just under 21 million. So overseas and domestic, it's opening above where the original Ant-Man opened up. It's gonna bring in more money than the original, but I'm not sure if it's gonna have the legs. We'll just have to see. Internationally though, I think it'll definitely do better, mostly because you have that big crowd coming in from Infinity War that's dying to see any more of the MCU. Coming in second this weekend is Incredibles 2, dropping just 37% to bring in over $29 million. This now puts Incredibles 2 domestic total to $504 million, when once you factor in inflation, is now the number one Pixar movie of all time domestic. It's barely beating out the original Finding Nemo at just over $500 million, and Finding Dory was coming in at $499 million, and both of those are adjusted figures. But the thing is, Incredibles isn't slowing down. So realistically, we're looking at something at least in the $650 million range, to be honest. Internationally this weekend, The Incredibles 2 debuted in France for another $10.6 million, and overall its international figure now stands at over $268 million, and it still has huge markets it is yet to open in, including South Korea, Japan, Germany, Italy, and Spain. So in total, its global total now stands at $727 million and climbing. The movies that it's going to pass next on the Pixar ranks are Ratatouille, Coco, and Monsters University. After that, it's the original Monsters Inc., and it will probably end up being number one, so this is just one of those movies that we end up seeing climb and climb and climb, and we'll keep you updated on that one. Falling 53% to just around $28.5 million is Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. Now, even though this is a pretty big drop and it's now being passed by Incredibles 2, it's still a very solid performance given how large it opened up and how overall it's still holding up internationally. While the Incredibles 2 may have crossed $500 million domestic, this weekend Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom managed to cross $1 billion global. So as I said in my last review, all these Jurassic World movies, except for one, are all grossing over $1 billion. This one is still going strong, and the domestic total now stands at $333 million, while its total global total now stands at $1,058 million. So AntMan and Universal also have a huge hit on their hands as well. Coming in fourth, the First Purge opened up with 17 million, with a 5-day total of over 31 million. It also opened up internationally to 10.9 million, and while these numbers may not seem like a lot, and it definitely doesn't seem like it's going to reach the previous movies and the box office that they ended up grossing, they cost almost nothing, as with many horror franchises like this, so really they end up making a good profit, especially in terms of margin, considering if it costs nothing to make, it doesn't need to make that much to make its money back and more. I expect to see hefty drops on this one, only because its word of mouth isn't very good, and that usually doesn't leave a film with a whole lot of room to gain any ground. Moving down the list, Deadpool 2 ended up moving up the list in terms of its all-time rank in the Marvel movies, and it passed Iron Man 2. Next up is the original Iron Man, which will be a little tough to catch. It may end up doing it, but I'm not quite sure at this point. Deadpool 2 right now has a global total of $727 million, whereas the original Iron Man has an adjusted total of $748 million. So it's going to need to add another $21 million, and I'm not sure that's in the cards for Deadpool 2 at this point, but it'll be pretty close. After that would be The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which, as many of you know, Spider-Man is the most popular Marvel character, so even though the movie was terrible, it did benefit from the international audience who knows and loves Spider-Man. But since that movie, when you adjust it, is over $780 million, I think it's going to be out of range for Deadpool 2, but still an impressive run and an impressive sequel in Deadpool 2. And for the last of my updates, I want to touch on Solo: A Star Wars Story. Now, I know you've heard a lot from this movie in the news, and most recently there was something that said, oh, Solo: A Star Wars Story is going to lose Disney $50 million as opposed to, making the hundreds of millions of dollars that it normally makes. But whoever came up with that figure didn't really do any of the correct calculations, and they actually just kind of threw a number out there and said, well, let's see, it cost maybe $475 million roughly or so about to make in terms of $300 million original budget and $175 million marketing budget. Even if you decrease that by a little, and the movie right now is at $379 million, so you could see, okay, maybe this movie ends up losing them about $50 million or so, and you just use that math. The problem is the theaters get around half of the money. So this person wasn't factoring that in, and you don't just double it. You then have to really move the numbers out and see how much Disney is really losing, how much Lucasfilm is really losing on this particular movie. Because it's not just $50 million. If it was $50 million, I don't think there'd be the panic that they do have right now over at Lucasfilm. So as you've seen with these top movies, they all seem to be Disney ones. So obviously Disney's pretty special, and as such, they do have a special deal. So whereas normally, on average, domestic at least, studios get 55% of the take and the movie theaters get 45% of the take, Disney ends up getting 60% of the take and the theaters 40% of the take, because they know their movies are huge and they bring in the big audiences and everything, and because they bring in families, that ends up usually meaning more concessions and everything. So that's the deal that Disney has with the theaters. That being said, internationally it's not the same. Disney doesn't have the same cachet over there that they do here. And although they still generally get huge numbers overseas, the other countries tend to dictate what they get. In some countries, like China, you may only get a third back. So we're just going to go and give them a nice solid average of 50%. Let's say Disney ends up getting 50% of the overseas cut. So that would mean overseas for Solo, they'd only end up getting $84.5 million. With the 60% for the domestic take that Disney would get back, it would still only equal out to $126.5 million. So total, it'd just be at $211 million. Not a huge number at all. And if you factor in that it costs about $475 million to make and market, we're not looking at a $50 million loss anymore. We're looking at least a $250 to $300 million loss, depending on how the numbers work out internationally, everything like that. But really all I want to do is kind of clear the air in terms of how much money this movie is actually losing. It's not $50 million. That's not how you calculate how much a movie makes. You don't just take the total gross and assume the studio gets all of it. No, the theaters get a huge chunk of it. Personally, I'd call that kind of sloppy reporting, and then also anyone who jumps onto it without thinking about it, same thing there. Just make sure you understand that the theaters take a huge cut. Even if you're Disney, who's special and gets 60%, they're still losing out on a ton of money with Solo, possibly around that $250 million range. So we'll have to see what changes go forward with that, but let me know what you thought about this weekend. Did you think Ant-Man was going to be a little higher? Did you go see Ant-Man and contribute to some of that opening? Have you finally caught up on Incredibles 2 and Jurassic World? Let me know your thoughts on the weekend's box office and on these movies, and we'll catch you later.